The Republican Party in the format that it existed in pre-Trump is not coming back. The populists that have pledged their loyalty to Trump are not pledging them to Republican values. They're pledging their loyalty to Trump personally. And it's become such a cult of personality that it doesn't matter what Trump does. They don't care who else is in the party. They don't care what he says or does or is caught doing or admits to. He is a lock. Now, one of the things that we saw is that he can't possibly win the general election. Before the indictments, when we had the midterms, which we were expecting to be a red wave that wasn't, the reason was independents showed up in numbers. Now, independents usually don't vote in midterm elections. They usually only vote in the generals, and they usually have some serious buyer's remorse. They tend to vote against whoever won the last time. And if you polled the independents after the midterm vote, they, by very strong numbers, said that they personally found Biden's economic management of the country to be disastrous, especially for them personally. But they still massively voted for Democrats. What Trump is trying to do with the election denialism is tell the country and litigate for the country that the general election no longer matters. Well, if you're an independent, that's the only place in the system that you matter. They don't vote in the primaries or the caucuses. They only vote in the general. And if the general doesn't matter, then the independents have basically lost their citizenship. And so they are willing to vote against their own perceived economic best interest to prevent that from happening. American diplomats have this lovely saying for the Middle East: one person, one vote, but not one time. And that's basically what Trump is pushing for, to overturn the electoral system so that he or people that he appoints can rule forever. And for independents, that's a non-starter. And so they have turned very, very firmly against him. Well, if you look at the spread of the vote, both when Trump ran against Hillary Clinton, as well as when he ran against Joe Biden, in all but 5 states that he won by a margin that was smaller than the independent vote. If independents were willing to show up and vote in midterms, you bet their ass they're going to show up in the general election. And they will hold their nose and they will vote for Joe Biden. And that means that we are looking at a wipeout of Republicans at the national level, at least on par to what we saw in 1984. Of course, Trump will scream from the rooftops that it was all rigged, but independents don't buy it. And that's all that really matters in this election. We've identified the demographic on which this is going to turn, and they've already made their views known. So all Biden has to do to walk away with this is not die, and it's his. Including people at Fox keep coming with me with theories, and then I investigate them and they don't pan out. I just don't know. I just know that his post-Fox presentations, anything that involves Biden or Ukraine, the syntax, in many cases, the specific grammar choices, show somebody who speaks English as a second language. They're very Slavic. And if you look at what's happened in Russian propaganda, and the same hour that he posts his stuff, it's the same exact material. So the link there is very firm, it's very strong, but I don't understand his motivation. Conversation has already been had and discounted out, of course. Biden, one of the things that he's doing right now is he's trying to recoup Democratic support for the union movement. The IRA was very big in that. Remember that during the Trump administration, Trump was very, very successful at courting the union vote. And a majority of union members did vote for Trump in round 2. And so Biden now is trying to pull those guys back into the Democratic coalition, and doing anything that loosens the tariffs in any meaningful way with China would be working the other direction. So there is a case to be made that the tariffs are unnecessarily inflationary. That's a very complicated, nuanced discussion with a lot of pros and cons. It is real, but siding with the people who want the tariffs to go away would probably cost Biden the union vote, and he's fought very, very hard to get that back, so I don't see it happening. I don't have an opinion on golf. I'm afraid not. I can tell you that this, for the Saudis, everything is on the table right now. When you realize that the country that you thought was going to first fight for you like mercenaries isn't, then you have to call everything into question. So that is part of the reason that they're allowing women to drive and get educations, because they know they're going to need more workforce. That's part of the reason why they're warming up to the relationship with the Indians because they know they need workforce at that level. And that's one of the reasons they're accepting payment for some of their oil in yuan in order to build a more constructive relationship with the Chinese. They're searching for options. And right now, nothing really good is on the table to replace the US Army. My general position has been that the Chinese will cease to exist before the Russians because the Russians just are more durable culturally and they're not dependent upon economic activity, growth, and global access in order to keep their systems running, whereas the Chinese are utterly dependent on those things. To this point, most of the conversation has been what do the Chinese think about the Russians rather than the other way around, because they saw what happened with Wagner and they were terrified. The Chinese are very clearly the biggest losers internationally from the Ukraine war, with the obvious exception of the Ukrainians themselves, because they're now getting most of their crude from the world's longest supply line that goes from the Baltic Sea around Portugal through Suez and by India and Vietnam and Taiwan before it gets to northern China. It's very disruptible. It's much worse than what they had pre-war. And they're afraid that if they lose the Russians, they'll also lose their, to be perfectly blunt, their useful idiot. Whenever the Chinese are thinking of doing something that might be a little risky, they always try to nudge the Russians to do it first to see how it goes, and then they adjust. They're not really thrilled with how the Ukraine war has gone, but they really don't want to lose their useful idiot. But you're right, we do need to consider the flip side of this. We are one trade embargo away from the end of the Chinese system. And the cult of personality that we have in Beijing is much tighter and much more incompetent than anything we've got on the Russian side of the equation. If China were to dissolve tomorrow, however, I don't think that appreciably changes what the Russians would do. The Russians see this accurately as a battle for their national survival. And nothing as simple as the loss of their primary international ally is going to change what they do. The only thing that would theoretically force them to change tact is if you had a change of heart in Beijing that included them putting 1 million men on their northern border with the Russians. That would get Moscow's attention. But I don't think that is in the cards for any time soon. Good question. I'd say 3 to 6 months. Remember that Russia is the world's largest or second largest oil exporter and the world's second largest agricultural exporter. China is the world's largest importer of both of those things. And if you put the same sanctions on Beijing that are on Moscow right now, you would get a famine and a deindustrialization collapse in well under a year, complete with famine. 4 years ago, I was very confident that Chairman Xi was fully aware of his exposures. But in the last 4 years, he has purged the system of anyone who will tell him anything. Not anyone who will tell him the truth, anyone who will tell him anything. There is no information flow within the Chinese system any longer because he's shot the messenger so many times. So it's entirely possible now that Chinese propaganda is actually what he believes. And give you an idea of just how extreme that this has gotten. You guys remember that spy balloon nonsense from last year? Okay. I initially had the same thought as President Biden when the balloon came over. Let's shoot the thing down. Let's see what we're dealing with. Clearly, it was a spy balloon. The balloon was 350 feet in diameter. It was dangling something the size of an Embraer jet that carries 70 people. So clearly, it was a spy platform. The Defense Department and the CIA talked him out of that because, like, Mr. President, it's not going to get anything.